What's up, FYF Sports, man? It's Lamont. We back. We got part 3 of the epic mini-series. 90s NBA players were overrated. And so today we're going to be talking about small forwards of the 90s. And I keep telling you guys I'm going to break down all positions of the 90s to debunk the myth that this 90s era was just filled with elite basketball talent when that was not the case. And again, I'm not knocking the top guys in the 90s. There were some elite guys in the 90s, but to say that this was the greatest era of basketball all the time is an overstatement, to say the least. But before we get into that, make sure you guys like, comment, subscribe, hit the notification bell. Do that for every video that you watch. Again, if you want to stay in tune, stay in touch, not just with this epic mini series, but if you just want to stay in touch with everything that we post, make sure that you hit the notification bell. All right. Also, don't forget, man, especially tune in on Fridays. On videos that we drop on Fridays, we also let you know who the winner is for the drawings. We do giveaways every Friday for all the subscribers who engage and interact with all of our content. So without further ado, man, we're just going to get right into this. Again, we're going to be going over the top 20 best small forwards today, small forwards of the 90s. Now, just based on the little research that I've done, again, I would say I would classify this list as being subpar. That would be the key word to describe the small forwards of the 90s. So, we're not going to hold you up. We got a long list. Again, I'm going to blow through this list really quickly. I don't want to spend too much time going into the specifics of each player, but we will touch on them briefly, and we will talk about some of the stars. All right, first up on this list, we got Dennis Scott. Dennis Scott, he came onto the scene when Shaq and Penny were with the Orlando Magic. They made a run to the finals, eventually got swept. Dennis Scott was a great three-point shooter, but again, as with most NBA players in the 90s, they had one specialty and one specialty only, and he was a three-point shooter. Again, there's not too much to his game. He wasn't extremely quick. He wasn't athletically gifted. He wasn't a great defender. So again, Dennis Scott had a solid career in the NBA. Nothing overwhelming, nothing memorable about Dennis Scott of the Orlando Magic. Next up, we got Jamal Mashburn. Now, Jamal Mashburn, offensively, this man was definitely gifted. But he spent a lot of time on teams that were just losing teams in the NBA. So, again, as I've told you guys before, what I always figure into my, when I'm determined if you were an elite player in the 90s, you got to show me something. You got to show me at least 1 year. Be dominant 1 year. Get your team deep into the playoffs. Compete. I know you had Michael Jordan in your era who was in the way, but at least put yourself in a position to compete against these guys in the playoffs. Jamal Mashburn was never able to do that. One of the main things with him, and this is the biggest knock on a lot of players in that era, was his fitness. His fitness was always a problem. He was never in great condition. He was never in great shape. And he always relied on his offensive ability with that jumper to score the ball. I feel like if he would have paid more attention to his diet and his health, staying in better shape, he could have been more of an elite player. But we have Jamal Mashburn, elite scorer, not very much of a defender, and played on losing teams his entire career. Next up, we got Larry Johnson. Larry Johnson was one of those guys. Again, they actually also had him classified as a power forward as well. As a small forward, he was okay. Again, Larry Johnson's just one of those. He spent a lot of time in Charlotte with the Charlotte Hornets and Alonzo Mourning. Those two guys, for whatever reason, couldn't get along. That would have been a good 1-2 punch if they could have found a way to make it work in Charlotte. They couldn't get along, so Charlotte never had much success as far as getting deep into the playoffs. 90s fans will tell you that they ran into Jordan in the playoffs, so I guess that buzzsaw right there thwarted any championships hopes for that duo. He did have some success in New York, but at the end of the day, he was a shell of himself in New York due to injury. Same with Larry Johnson. Fitness towards the end of his career became a concern. Injuries riddled his career. and we never saw the greatest that Larry Johnson could have given to the game. Next up, we got Toni Kukoc. Toni Kukoc, the Croatian. He came and joined the Bulls in their run on their second three-peat. Again, he's a good player. You know, he's a solid player. He was one of the first to bring that foreign style game over to the NBA. A lot of guys didn't like it. I mean, he was solid. The one thing he didn't have in his arsenal was defense. Phil Jackson has talked about this time and time again. Toni Kukoc just did not have it defensively. Offensively, he was extremely streaky. That's the best way I can explain this game. He would have games where he would make shots. He would have games where he couldn't make anything at all. Again, so inconsistency riddled his career. The best thing I can say about him is Phil Jackson was able to rely on him for some clutch shots. But other than that, you know, again, Toni Kukoc rode the coattails of Michael Jordan and Scottie Pippen to get his championships. You know, without Michael Jordan and Scottie Pippen on his team, we don't remember much of Toni Kukoc when he left the Bulls and played on other NBA teams to finish out his career. But we have Toni Kukoc, an average player, I would say. Maybe had one or two slightly above average years, but never was really considered an all-star in the NBA. Next up, we got Cedric Ceballos, man. Cedric Ceballos. Again, he's athletically gifted. Definitely with his athleticism could have played in today's era. He even had a 50-point game in the NBA. But again, this was a lot of hype that just never panned out. I put Cedric Ceballos in that Harold Miner category. Again, with this athleticism, you know, everybody was looking for the next Jordan. So, like same with Harold Miner, they call Harold Miner Baby Jordan. They were looking for these guys to somehow blossom and bloom into the next Jordan. These guys never necessarily panned out into the player that anyone thought they would be. Ceballos, you know, again, great leaper, turned himself into a better shooter, got traded around the league a lot, turned into a journeyman, but to say the least, he was just a journeyman, never really was considered an all-star. He did have some good games, but just could never put together a string of great seasons to where we would say that he was a great player in this league. So we have Cedric Ceballos, underachiever, didn't live up to the hype or potential. We got Cliff Robinson, man. Cliff Robinson at small forward. Now, this is another guy, just like Larry Johnson. He spent a lot of time at power forward as well. So a lot of people will say he was power forward, but for most of his career, especially the prime of his career when he was with the Blazers, he was a small forward. Now, this guy was athletic, but again, with Cliff Robinson, he had some all-star seasons. But no one, you know, ever looked at him as a dominant force on any particular team that he was on. He was a good player. He was serviceable. He wasn't the player that you put on your team and say he's going to lead us to the playoffs or anything. So he always played behind great players. He played behind Drexler. They ran into the Bulls in the finals, but again, that wasn't necessarily Cliff Robinson getting him in there. You had guys like Terry Porter. You had guys like Clyde Drexler. Those were the primary guys really leading the Blazers at that point in time. I look at Cliff Robinson as a Horace Grant type. He's a Horace Grant type of player. He's a third wheel. He's a third wheel on a good team because of his defense and some of the intangible things that he can do. Now, I think Cliff's game, because of his length and size, his ability to stay in shape, he could definitely play in the NBA today. He could definitely play in the NBA today, primarily because he can guard the 2, 3, and 4 position very easily. So I like his versatility. He's one of my favorite players of this era. Again, at the end of the day, he just did not have the offensive skill set for me to classify him as a difference maker or one of the best players in the 90s. He was a good player. He was never considered great, but he did have a good career. Cliff Robinson, y'all. All right, next up, man. We got all of these subpar players, man. All of these subpar players. You know, next up we have Sharif Abdul-Rahim. Again, this is another player here who he started career off as a small forward. but because of fitness issues, the man actually ended his career. He ended his career being a power forward center. He was solid. He had a solid career. Never dominant, never great. Again, played on a lot of losing teams year after year after year. And again, this is a common theme with some of these great players in the 90s. You have a lot of great players who are so-called great players in the 90s who were able to fill up the stat sheet on really, really bad teams. But at the end of the day, their overall game just didn't affect winning. These teams were not able to win. And again, I'm not just talking about teams matching up with Jordan in the playoffs or even getting to the finals. The Grizzlies were a perennial loser. They were never competitive, even with a player like Sharif Abdul, who came out of college with a lot of hype around his name. All right, next up we got Detlef Schrempf, man. Detlef Schrempf. This is another guy who is considered to be just a perennial role player. He was solid in his role. He was never asked to lead a team. He was never necessarily an elite player. He was just that player that you love to have on your team because he just seemed to make things work. He was one of those versatile players that could play not just the small forward but the power forward position as well. I would never say he was never an elite defender. He was one of the better shooters in the league. That's why they loved him at that power forward position. It brought bigs out of the paint. They had to honor him on the perimeter. But aside from that, when he was with the Seattle Supersonics, again, nothing memorable. Just a very solid role player. Played his role, hit the 3-ball when necessary. But he's not the type of player you're going to ask to lead a team. You're not even going to ask this guy to be the number 2 on your team. He was just a good role player, solid career. And it's just amazing that we got players like this making the top 20. And again, we're past the top 20. So again, when we're starting to get into the meat of the best small forwards in the 90s, and we already are at players like Detlef Schrempf. Again, not too thrilled with his game. He was on a team with Sean Kipp and Gary Payton that got to the finals, but again, that was Sean Kipp and Gary Payton's team. Detlef Schrempf and all the other guys, those were just role players, just helping them kind of get there, basically. So we got Detlef Schrempf for the Seattle Supersonics. He also spent some time with the Indiana Pacers. Next up, got Sean Elliott. Sean Elliott, similar to Detlef Schrempf. Again, he was a perennial role player. And the time, again, a lot of people knock Draymond Green. A lot of people will knock Draymond Green because when he had the opportunity to play and step up and be an all-star, as many claimed him to be, or a potential Hall of Famer, well, Draymond Green, because of Draymond Green's injuries and just multiple championship runs over the years, he just wasn't able to play up to his ability. Sean Elliott wasn't in that situation when David Robinson went down. And when David Robinson went down, Sean Elliott could not lead the Spurs. They ended up having one of the worst records in the NBA, which ultimately led them to being able to get that lottery pick, which turned into Tim Duncan. So either they tanked, and he was just part of that. It was just their plan to throw the season, which is something that I think happened, or he's just not the type of player you can have lead a team. He was a great corner 3-point shooter. He was a great specialist, but aside from that, there was nothing spectacular about this man's game. So we have Sean Elliott of the San Antonio Spurs, great 3-point shooter, not the player you need to lead your team, was not a great athlete, solid defender on that Spurs team, but other than that, we're not asking Sean Elliott to do much more than that. Next up, we got Dennis Rodman. And I'm surprised he's so low on this list. Again, this is another player who spent the bulk of his time at power forward. We saw that he was on our power forwards list, and I didn't have anything bad to say about Dennis Rodman. But he did play small forward when he was with the Pistons in the early 90s. And he did a fairly good job. Again, Dennis Rodman, he's known as the greatest role player of all time. He's not a player. He's never been a player that you can put on your team and say, you're going to be the leader of this team. You're going to lead us to the championship. No, he's a great piece to a championship contending team. He struggled with the Spurs. Again, the Spurs and their best player was a center. And in the NBA in the 90s, what we do know is that if your best player was a center, you were going to struggle to win championships. Hakeem Olajuwon was able to do it twice when Jordan retired. But again, that only happened because Jordan retired. So Dennis Rodman was stuck on a team. When Dennis Rodman was with the Pistons, where Isaiah Thomas was the best player, they won championships. But when Dennis Rodman played for the Spurs, David Robinson the best player, they couldn't find success. Dennis Rodman had to ultimately go back to the Bulls and play with another guard to get back to winning championships. So again, just another fact for you guys to let you know that this was not a big man's league. This was a guard-driven league led by guards who could lead their team. But we got Dennis Rodman, nothing bad to say about the man, the greatest rebounder in NBA history, the greatest role player in NBA history. All right, next up we got Bernard King, man. Bernard King, I like Bernard King. So we have Bernard King here. Again, this is another great scorer. He was a great scorer in the 90s. But consistently, we see this time and time again with great players in this era. Bernard King was a great player, but in the 90s, he was stuck on terrible teams. He was stuck with the Washington Bullets, were one of the worst teams in the 90s. The same with the Clippers and Danny Manning. Again, he was a player on one of the worst teams in the NBA and was able to fill up the stat sheet because he was the only scorer on that particular team. So again, you get no credit for filling up the stat sheet on a really bad team. You have to actually convert that into winning to some degree, the same way Michael Jordan was able to do. Michael Jordan, when he had the opportunity with the Bulls and the right players were around him, he turned subpar players into champions and had them playing above their pay grade because of how great he was. We didn't necessarily get that out of Bernard King, although he did have a few great years. He had some great years in the NBA. Again, just a great scorer. I think he could play in this era because of his ability to score. But again, defensively, he was average, and then his ability to lead the team is something that we really have to look at because, especially when he was with the Bullets, he was never able to get his team over the hump and make them competitive whatsoever. But next up, we got James Worthy. James Worthy, the one I call James Worthy the most underrated defensive player of the 90s. That's what I would call James Worthy because he was on that Laker team. They essentially had him in that third wheel spot. James Worthy was just that type of guy. And so it's kind of tricky explaining James Worthy because in a sense, I think he's one of the more overrated players in NBA history, but he's one of the most underrated defenders in NBA history. So I think we give him too much credit because I think if we put him on another team like the Bucks or the Clippers or the Bullets, I don't know if he had the offensive ability or just the overall skills to lead a team by itself. And in the 90s, with all of the parity, all you needed was one or two all-stars to lead your team. I don't know if James Worthy was good enough to lead his team individually. We never had the opportunity to see that. But with his time in the Lakers, he did do his job well. He played a great role, playing with Magic, playing with Kareem and those guys. Byron Scott, he was great in his role. Again, they ran into that shooting guard in Chicago, Michael Jordan in the 90s, and they failed. So again, it's just another indicator that this was truly a guard-driven league led by guards that were the superstars. The guards were the only players that could lead their teams. The big men could not lead their teams the way the guards could. So James Worthy, a great rebounder, a great defender. I would say he's an average scorer. But for the most part, I would say his career, in his career, he was carried by Magic Johnson and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. Next up, we got Larry Bird, Larry Legend here. I would say he's the second greatest shooter in NBA history as of right now. Klay Thompson's right on his heels. So at the end of the day, I don't know if he'll still be the second, but Larry Bird, he did some amazing things in his career. It's sad that we have to put him on this list for the 90s because the bulk of his greatness was in the 80s. That's where we saw the true Larry Bird. And the fact that he's at the top of this list, or close to the top of the list in the 90s, it just tells you how weak the small forward position was in the 90s, especially with Larry Bird topping the list. So again, but in his career in the 80s, he was great. But right now, we're not discussing the 80s. In the 90s, he was good, but his career was up and down in the 90s because he had that nagging back injury that eventually forced him out of the NBA. So again, this is a common theme with a lot of these great players. Again, and you can blame it on the lack of technology and things of that nature. But again, keeping yourself in great shape, maintaining a high level of fitness will help you avoid injuries. And Larry Bird had that nagging back injury that just derailed the end of his career in the 90s, and he just wasn't as efficient or effective as he was in the 80s. But then, great career, great player. Again, Hall of Famer, one of the best that we've ever seen do it. But again, when we talk about the 90s and the 90s only, he just wasn't as great as he was in the 80s. But great player, great career. Larry Bird of the Boston Celtics. All right, next up we got the big dog, Glenn Robinson. Now, he's another very odd player, because when he first came into the NBA, he was a small forward. Because he gained weight and lost his fitness, he transitioned into a power forward because he didn't have the speed to be a small forward anymore. And again, common theme, and again, out of Indiana, went to Purdue University, was probably the greatest player in Purdue basketball history. I think he's still probably the leading scorer all time in Purdue basketball. But so he's a legend out there at Purdue University. But with regards to the NBA, again, he was stuck on a Bucks team that just could not find success. They were losers for most of his time there. They had one or two great seasons with Sam Cassell and Ray Allen. Some people call them a big three. I think they were far from a big three. I think it was just three good players, three good veterans on a team that led them very well. They had some success, but at the end of the day, they weren't champions. And again, just getting to the playoffs once or twice, that's fine. Maybe making an All-Star game once, that's fine. But nobody, when we look at NBA history, nobody's going to reflect back on the 90s and say, the big dog, Glenn Robinson, was one of the greatest small forwards of the 90s. That just doesn't happen. He was good. He was serviceable. But towards the end of his career, he lost his fitness. Eventually got a championship with, I think it was the San Antonio Spurs. But again, that wasn't even in the 90s. That was in the 2000s, and he was on the way out the door. So he was just a very, very average player on a great championship team. All right, next up we got Dan Marley, man. He's here in Phoenix, man. Dan Marley. Again, he's like a hybrid player because of his shooting ability. He could definitely play in any era. He could play in this era. He can play in that era. Surprisingly, of all the players that we talked about, this guy was probably one of the better defenders. He was a really good defender, was able to shoot the three, so he will be a classic 3-and-D guy in this era. But again, even in this era, we have a lot of 3-and-D guys. 3-and-D guys like Klay Thompson, like Robert Covington. Again, we don't look at them as superstar players, but we look at them as really good players. Now, Klay Thompson has turned into an all-star in that particular role. I think Marley could potentially be an all-star in this era. So he's one of the more memorable players of this era, just with the name Thunder Dan, the way he played on that Phoenix team, the way he competed against Michael Jordan. I can give him credit for what he did in this era. Again, this is a name we will remember. And again, he's a legend here in Phoenix. That name rings a bell everywhere in Phoenix. So again, he left a mark like that here in Phoenix. Again, I got to give you some credit for that, because his name in this entire state rings a bell. So I definitely appreciate what Dan Marley brought to the game. I like his versatility. I think he could play in this era because of his versatility, being able to guard multiple positions, and with the three-point shot. But we got Dan Marley of the Phoenix Suns. All right, next up we got Glenn Rice. Now this is another player I don't necessarily consider him a small forward. Don't necessarily consider him a small forward. Now, back in this time, guards were shorter. I would really consider this guy a two guard, if anything. But in this era, he would probably have to play the three, because I don't think he had the foot speed to play with the twos of this era, but he definitely would be considered an elite three-point shooter in this era. His shooting ability would put him in any era. He's gonna mold. His ability to shoot the ball, his ability to score the ball, especially early on in his career when he was with Charlotte, was great. And then later on in his career, he just became a three-point specialist. But again, this man is a solid player. I give him credit for that. Again, didn't have the ability to when he had the opportunity, he did not lead his team to greatness. He was able to compile a lot of stats on some bad teams. So I always hold that against players. I cannot give you credit for compiling a lot of stats when you play on these bad teams. But at the end of the day, when we look at his ability to guard multiple positions, just like Dan Marley, and shoot the three ball, along with his ability to attack the basket, and early on in his career, he was surprisingly athletic, a little bit more athletic. He did lose his fitness somewhat towards the middle of his career and the end of his career. But again, I respect his game. Nothing really bad to say about him other than the fact that he's not a player that you're going to just drop on a team and say he's going to be the leader of this team. But he was a good player, great 3-and-D guy. All right, now, Chris Mullin. Now, so Chris Mullin is just one of those players where I think he was slightly overrated for his era. It would just kind of be odd to see how he would translate into this era, because I don't know if he has the speed to play in this era. His game kind of reminds me of Davis Bertans, just because he lacks the foot speed, but he finds ways to be effective. He was a great scorer on a lot of bad teams until he got with the Indiana Pacers. And again, he was in the opposite conference than Michael Jordan. So, the fact that he managed to find himself in the Hall of Fame is quite surprising, especially being that he could never find success in the playoffs. By the time he found success in the playoffs, he was probably the third, fourth, or fifth best player on that Pacer team, depending on how you see it, and just wasn't the same guy that he was with the Warriors. But Chris Mullin was a great shooter. His shooting would easily translate to this era. I think the speed of the game would affect him. So because of the speed of the game, he would be a great player on certain teams who actually slow the ball down, like the Spurs. But for the most part, I do respect his game. I just did not agree with the fact that they have this man in the Hall of Fame, or even one of the 50 greatest players of all time. I think that part of it is a bit overhyped. He was a good player at St. John's. He was a good player for the Warriors. Hall of Famer, let's hold off on that, because again, he accumulated a lot of stats on some bad teams in the NBA. But we have Chris Mullin of the Golden State Warriors and the Indiana Pacers. All right, Dominique Wilkins. Nothing bad to say about Dominique. Human highlight reel. The name says it speaks for itself. Human highlight reel. What can you say about that? Even after tearing his Achilles, this man was able to bounce back. He's had some of the most historic scoring seasons in NBA history, and he was able to string multiple seasons like this together. But again, when we talk about Dominique Wilkins, we have to talk about the fact that his teams struggled to find or sustain a lot of success. And again, when we talk to these fans of the 90s, they always go back and say that, he played in Jordan's era. But again, even if we go back and look at Jordan's championship runs, how many times did Jordan's Bulls match up with Dominique Wilkins? Jordan's championship teams match up with Dominique Wilkins. I don't remember any time where the Jordan's Bulls actually matched up with Dominique Wilkins in the NBA playoffs when the Bulls were making those championship runs. So I don't like to use that excuse that Jordan was in his way, because he was never able to even put his team in a position to meet up with the Bulls in the playoffs. So I do hold that against Dominique Wilkins. But at the end of the day, probably one of the greatest athletes in the game of basketball. He did dunk contest dunks in game. He eventually developed a jump shot towards the end of his career, where obviously his fitness, he had let his fitness go somewhat. But again, this guy will go down in the history books for being one of the greatest scorers of all time, being one of the greatest athletes of all time. Definitely his game would translate into any era because of his ability to play multiple positions, be athletic, get to the basket, and do whatever he wants. We got Dominique Wilkins of the Atlanta Hawks. We got Grant Hill. Again, I consider Grant Hill one of the greatest players that could have been. And that's the best way to describe Grant Hill's game, is one of the greatest players that could have been. We saw flashes of greatness. We saw flashes of greatness when he was with the Pistons, when he first entered the NBA. The problem with his game was that he was never available. Injuries derailed this man's career. Similar to Chris Mullin, I just don't think he did enough to get into the Hall of Fame with regards to his NBA career. At Duke, I think his years at Duke were so great. I think compiled with what he did in the NBA, I think that's what got him into the Hall of Fame. But with regards to his career in the NBA, it wasn't as great as some would lead you to believe. It was just injury riddled when he partnered up with Tracy McGrady in Orlando. That was supposed to be the making of one of the best duos in NBA history. That got derailed by injuries. When he was in Detroit, ankle surgery after ankle surgery after ankle surgery. That was derailed. And again, now when we're talking about his game would translate to any era. He could guard multiple positions. He could play multiple positions offensively as well. Probably one of the quickest crossovers in NBA history that I think a lot of people don't give him credit for. Some of the greatest footwork in NBA history. Again, just a career. It's unfortunately, again, it was just derailed by injury. And again, I can't knock his game. When he was available, he was great. But he had so many injuries over his career. Again, it just limited his effectiveness, and it just limited what could have been. So he's the greatest player that could have been. He could have been one of the greatest players in NBA history. But I love this game. We just never saw the best of Grant Hill because of the injuries. All right, and we got Scottie Pippen, man. Scottie Pippen, man. This dude right here, you put this guy alongside Jordan. When you put this guy alongside Jordan, and then Jordan just like that instantly starts winning championships, we really have to look into his role in those Bull teams winning championships. When we think about it, Jordan didn't win any championships until he got this man right here. And I think it was this man's sacrifice. I think it was his sacrifice that helped push the Bulls over the top and get them multiple championships. He sacrificed his scoring. He locked in where the Bulls needed him. He guarded sometimes power forwards, better small forwards. He did that. He took the toughest matchups. I think those small things gave Jordan just that additional breather that allowed Jordan to excel and be great offensively. So there we go, man. We got Scottie Pippen. There's nothing to say about this man's game. 6-time champion. And then what I liked about Scottie Pippen is when Michael Jordan stepped away from the game. When Michael Jordan stepped away from the game, Scottie Pippen was arguably arguably the best player in basketball. That's arguable. All-Star game MVP. I think he came up second or third in the MVP voting that year. Unfortunately, his team fell short in the playoffs to the Knicks. But nobody looked at the Bulls as a 50-win team when Jordan retired, and Pippen was able to lead them there. So I'll give him his props for that. Nothing bad to say about Scottie Pippen of the Chicago Bulls, man. And that just kind of rounds out our list, man. I appreciate you guys checking this out. Again, we went through a list of small forwards. Again, there were no surprises on that list. There was no finesse to that list. That was truly the top small forwards of the 90s. But again, when we look at that list and when you actually think about on each player's greatness, then you really have to ask yourself, were they really superstars? And I think in the 90s in general, the 90s fans were too quick to label people superstars. I don't think Chris Mullin was a superstar, but the 90s labeled him as a superstar Hall of Famer. Same with Grant Hill. I think Grant Hill had a lot of promise. He played like a superstar at times, but he never had the longevity for someone to just say he was a superstar of the 90s. He was never able to blossom and show it. It's just a lot of players on this list who were serviceable or were very good in their roles. Hard to say if they were just great, consistent all-star players or if they were just great role players. I mean, we look at Scottie Pippen, not just Scottie Pippen, but we got Dominique Wilkins as well. Those would probably be the top two in my book. Players that you can drop on a team and say, I need you to lead a team. I could drop Dominique Wilkins on the team and I could say he can lead that team for me, you know, if I had to choose out of these 90s power forwards. You know, even Scottie Pippen struggled in his second year without Jordan. The Bulls had a losing record until Jordan came back. So it's just hard. It's hard. It's not, you know, at their positions, they were all good, especially I would say the top five. They were good, but none of them had a major impact on their teams winning championships. Dominique Wilkins could, you know, never won a championship. Scottie Pippen was the second wheel to Michael Jordan. Obviously, he won championships, but when he left and joined the Rockets and the Blazers, we saw that he struggled without a Michael Jordan. So I like this. I don't really have anything extremely negative to say about the power forwards. My again, as I said in the beginning of this video, I would describe the power forwards. I would definitely describe the power forwards as subpar. Subpar would be the best word to describe small forwards of the 90s. So that's it for today, man. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. Again, I'm just breaking down the 90s. I'm not trying to finesse. I'm just doing it systematically. Small forwards of the 90s were subpar. The next video, we're going to be doing shooting guards in the 90s, and then we're going to close it out with the point guards. So again, this is all to, you know, I just don't, my purpose in doing this is that 90s fans, you don't have to prop up your entire era by calling so many players superstars just to elevate Jordan's greatness. We know how great Michael Jordan was. You don't have to prop guys up on a pedestal that he competed against and say that they were superstars to bolster Jordan's case for being the GOAT. Jordan is the GOAT. LeBron hasn't overtaken that yet. You don't have anything to worry about. LeBron probably will need to win maybe 3 championships to even be legitimately in that conversation. So again, slow down on all of the hyping up of the 90s. Again, you don't have to cap for some of these guys. You can admit when some of them are not as great as what you are leading us on to believe. So that's what we're just breaking down here. But again, I appreciate you guys for all the support, man. And we're going on the road to 10K. Road to 10K subscribers. Cannot wait till we get to 10K. We're going to be dropping that merch. But again, it's been another great show. Make sure you like, comment, and subscribe. But it's FYF Sports, man. And we out.